Just want to check. Welcome. I'm Trevor Eppehimer, and I teach theology and ethics at Good Theological Seminary, and I'm delighted to be back at First Presbyterian Church through the invitation of the Every Man's Bible class. I want to thank this church for partnering with Hood Theological Seminary over the years. We deeply appreciate being a partner with you in ministry. And I want to thank Hap and Annette Roberts for making this adult education series possible. And thank you for being here. It's work enough these days to get people to church, let alone Sunday school. So I'm delighted that you've shown up and turned off CBS Sunday morning to be here in the fellowship hall, or I guess this is the fellowship hall today. And happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. Today's talk is going to deal with human development. That's something mothers know quite well. So hopefully the topic of today fits the day. Last time I began by talking about the goal of your pastors. What I take from them, speaking with them, is for church to give you a Christian worldview. A Christian worldview where you see the world through a particular set of lenses that you can understand and interpret and describe reality in a Christian way. And to that end, if we don't have a Christian view of evil and suffering, that Christian worldview is incomplete and is lacking. So part of the reason why I decided to speak on this subject is because it's an important part of a Christian worldview, and sometimes it doesn't always get treated from the pulpit or in Sunday school classes. To that end, I selected this particular topic this time around. And as I mentioned to the people who were here last time, I've been participating in a text message chain with a pastor and a lawyer for about 3 years about the problem of evil, why bad things happen to good people. The lawyer on the text chain thinks that we should charge God with negligence for the way God governs this world because of the, at times, overwhelming amount of evil and suffering. So maybe one day we'll share these text messages with others besides the three, but it's been quite a ride these past 3 years, and it's stimulated my thinking and has caused me to go back and do some reading in this particular area. So I want to share some of my reading and thinking with you, and then hopefully there'll be enough time for discussion and so we can have some back and forth, and then you'll have to go to 11 o'clock. So let's get going. Last week we explored what's called privation theory. Privation theory comes to us from St. Augustine, a 4th century theologian. And basically, privation theory in Augustine's hands is designed to exonerate God of responsibility for evil in the world. And the way Augustine worked it is he begins by saying everything that God created is good. God created a good world, and that good world included no evil. But one of the creatures that God created, us, human beings, God gave us the good gift of freedom. And in giving us the good gift of freedom, God also opened the door for us to take that good thing that God gave us and misuse it and abuse it and introduce evil into the world through our free moral choices. And so we're the ones who actualize evil. We're the ones who are responsible for bringing it into the world, according to Augustine. And what this did in Augustine's mind is it exonerates God for responsibility for evil and suffering in the world. he pins it on us rather than on God. This week, we're going to move out of the 4th century into the 20th century. And we're going to look at two philosophers from the United Kingdom, Richard Swinburne and John Hick, both taught at Oxford, Cambridge, and they came up with a different philosophy, theological philosophy, when it comes to the existence of evil. Most important thing to know off the bat, what distinguishes them from Augustine is that they say God is responsible to a certain extent for the evil and suffering that is present in the creation. But God has good reasons for allowing evil and suffering to be actualized in God's good creation. So we're going to look at their reasoning, their thought, and then I'd like to hear from you what you think about this particular understanding of evil. Swinburne and Hick were raised in the British education system. And if you're raised in the British education system at the time when they were young, there were certain texts that you had to read. You were assigned to read certain texts that were part of British heritage, British culture. Shakespeare would be one of those texts, but also texts, poems, and letters by the British Romantic poet John Keats. Maybe you read some John Keats when you studied literature back in college. He was born in 1795, but died in 1821, died of tuberculosis at the age of 25. Many consider him to be the finest of the British Romantic poets. Swinburne and Hick were captivated, stimulated by a particular letter that Keats wrote to his younger brother who was living in Louisville, Kentucky at the time. Keats suffered from tuberculosis. That's what took him from us at the age of 25. And in this letter, he wrote to his brother the following: "Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I say soul making, soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities. How then are souls to be made? How but by a medium of a world like this? Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to make a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways." A veil of soul making. So veil is an old-timey word for a world. Keats says we live in a soul-making world. And part of the way that our souls get made in this world is by encountering, being challenged by, experiencing evil and suffering. And so it was this basic idea that animated the thought of the philosophers Richard Swinburne and John Hick. And they took, inspired by Keats, launched by this particular moment in this letter that Keats wrote to his brother, they went back and read a theologian who was even older than Augustine, a 2nd century theologian by the name of Irenaeus. Now, Presbyterians, you're not expected to know who Irenaeus is, because he is the founding theologian for the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition. But it's important to know something about him, primarily for today, his influence on Swinburne and Hick. Irenaeus had a unique way of reading the first chapter of the book of Genesis. In particular, he zeroed in on the 26th verse of that first chapter. And in that verse, God says, let us make humans in our image according to our likeness. Now, Augustine and other Western thinkers saw these two things as a parallelism. Likeness and image were synonymous. They were just a way of stating the same thing. For Irenaeus, God's image and God's likeness denoted two different kinds of things. And they relate to human beings in the following way. Irenaeus said, we are created in God's image in search of God's likeness. Created in God's image in search of God's likeness. So Irenaeus basically was saying, we don't come into this world equipped with all that we need. We come into this world as immature, imperfect beings. And when we come into this world, God has put us on a course, a path to acquire spiritual and moral maturity. We're supposed to grow and develop into something. We don't start off perfect. We start off imperfect. We are made by God for development. Now, this is very different from the way St. Augustine looked at the first chapter of Genesis. For him, Adam and Eve were perfect beings. And that's why their fall was so tragic and devastating. They fell from a state of perfection into sin. They had it all and they lost it. For Irenaeus, they never had it all at the beginning. They were naive. They were childlike. They were not yet fully human adult persons. They were created to grow and develop. And this is one of the reasons why they were susceptible to the temptation in the garden. They were children who were naive and easily taken advantage of. The goal of the Christian life for Irenaeus is to take us from children of Adam to children of Christ, people who bear the image of Christ. We're supposed to grow into God's likeness. And God's likeness is seen in its perfected form in the person of Christ. So Irenaeus said, well, how do you move the human being from point A to point B? How do you move the human being from God's image into God's likeness? How do you move the human being from a state of spiritual and moral immaturity to a state of spiritual and moral maturity? And Irenaeus said, well, you have to live and grow and develop in a certain kind of world that has certain kind of qualities, certain kinds of ingredients that facilitate maturity, that facilitate spiritual and moral development. We have to live, in other words, in a person-making world or a soul-making world. So what must this world have in it in order to bring us from a state of immaturity to maturity as moral and spiritual beings? Ask any educator, and they will tell you that the way you grow and develop students is to introduce challenges, obstacles, difficulties, problems that they must solve. Education is not fun for kids because it's not supposed to be. It's difficult, it's hard, it challenges them. And when all you want to do is sit on a couch and play video games, right? School is the last place you want to be because it's challenging you to grow and develop. It's putting things before you that are difficult in the hope that you will acquire the confidence that a good student needs to say, I can do this. As long as I work hard, I can figure this out. Then after I figure this out, a good teacher puts another challenge, another obstacle in front of the student, and they figure that out too. And they get smarter and smarter, and their confidence increases with the more skills they are able to acquire, the more challenges they're able to overcome educationally. Well, folks, you thought you left school long time ago, but you've been in school the whole time, in a second kind of school, a different kind of school. And this, for Irenaeus, is God's school of spiritual and moral development. And the classroom is your daily life. And the lessons are the challenges and the obstacles and the hardships and the setbacks that you face on a daily basis. God is an educator, and that's why life is not always fun. Life is not always pleasurable. Life is not always easy, because it's not supposed to be. Because this world is designed to take you from a state of spiritual and moral immaturity to a state of spiritual and moral maturity. And this, for Swinburne and Hick, is the answer to the problem of evil. Yes, God allows for evil and suffering, but God has good reasons for allowing it to be present in this world. They serve an educational purpose, according to these philosophers. What kind of challenges are built into this world? Well, according to Swinburne and Hick, you can start with so-called natural evils: earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, droughts, floods, extreme weather. All of these present significant challenges, are the source of hardship and tragedy. They're the things that are in this world that make being human difficult. And they're there to challenge us, to help us to grow in a number of different ways. I mean, think about human civilization and what's the driving force behind it. You know, how much is climate and drought, the impetus for the development of human civilization, trying to solve these problems, coming together to work together to make human life possible in a difficult, challenging world. For Hick and Swinburne, God gives us another challenge. And these challenges are wrapped up in the kind of bodies that we have. Our skin is literally thin. We bleed easy. Our bones are brittle. They break. Our organs are easily damaged. We live in fragile, vulnerable bodies. And Swinburne and Hick says this is by design. This is to make life difficult for us. Because difficulty produces growth. This is why we're not supermen and superwomen from Krypton living under the power of the yellow sun. Right? We can get hurt. We can get tired. We can die. We're susceptible to viruses and cancers. And this is part of God's plan, according to these philosophers. James Baldwin, African-American novelist, said, human vulnerability should be drawing us together. Human fragility should be creating ties and bonds of solidarity that transcend age, race, and religion, gender. The fact that we are in fragile bodies should be causing us to form alliances with one another, to help one another, to empathize with one another. We all know how hard it is to be a human being. And we know that other people experience those same hardships because they are in the same kind of bodies that we are. The problem, Baldwin says, is we take that and we, instead of forming bonds of solidarity and cooperation, we get into our bomb shelters and bunkers and try to isolate ourselves from one another and protect one another without, apart from forming any kind of alliances. We think that we can go it alone. But our vulnerability has been put there by God so that we form bonds of cooperation with one another, that we help one another. This is the lesson, according to Swinburne and Hick, that God is trying to teach us by us being in this world that's difficult to live in, being in these bodies that are subject to decay. Now, what if Swinburne and Hick say life were like a video game. And no one could ever get hurt. And if you got killed, you just got another life automatically to continue to resume the game. What would life be like under those conditions? And Swinburne and Hicks said it would be a world without morality. Because if there were no consequences, if there was no possibility of being physically harmed, there would be no such thing as right and wrong. There would be no difference between shaking someone's hand and punching them in the face. It would all be the same because we'd be all invulnerable. But it's the harm that we can do to one another that is the cause, the source of moral categories of right and wrong to begin with. We need to live in a world where harm can be done to us and we can do harm to other people if we are to have a thing called morality, right and wrong. And so this is why God designed the world this way, and God made us the way that God made us, so that we would become moral beings. We reflect on how difficult life is for us and for other people. We're able to develop compassion and empathy. We have a sense of justice and right and wrong. And this all stems from the fact that we are not super persons, according to Hick and Swinburne. Now, some objections to this theory. While we close out. Some other philosophers have questioned Hick and Swinburne. They say, all right, we understand what you mean by the world having to be a certain way in order for human beings to be challenged, to grow and develop morally and spiritually. But could God have turned down the dial on pain and suffering a little bit? I mean, could the lessons, the challenges, the obstacles have to be so harsh? Did God have to include childhood leukemia in the mix of creation? Does God have to allow for a world where genocide can take place? I mean, can we learn the lessons of Nazi Germany without having to experience the full terrible reality of Nazi Germany? So this is where some philosophers push back on this particular perspective. Swinburne and Hick, acknowledging the difficulty of this position, push back and say, well, do you want to be a person? Do you want to have a soul? Do you want to grow and develop into God's likeness? Do you want to grow and develop as a spiritual and moral person? Well, if your answers to those questions are yes, then this is the world that produces such persons. And it's a world that includes childhood leukemia, that includes genocide. And the American philosophers usually don't like this so much. They think this is a cultural British thing, a stiff upper lip thing. These are Brits saying, you just got to get tough and deal with it. Americans question this, and American philosophers in a way, they say, do the life lessons have to be so intense, so hard, so painful? Another aspect of, and the concluding aspect of this philosophy is that God desires a relationship with human beings that is non-coerced, that is free, that is voluntary. God doesn't want to strong-arm us into a relationship with God. And so if that's true, John Hick in particular has done a lot of work on this. He said, how must God be present in the world if God is to elicit such a relationship where he wants people to freely come to him and develop that relationship? Well, Hick says it has to be a world in which God's presence is hidden from humanity to a certain extent. If God were present all the time, say in an embodied way, where God could hold press conferences and issue press releases and visit people face to face in this world, God's presence would be so overwhelming to us, said Hick, that we couldn't do anything but fall down and worship God and enter into relationship with God, because God would be so amazing, so attractive, so overwhelming to us, there would be no space for free response. So God hides God's self from us, says Hick. Doesn't make God's self totally available to us. Gives us hints of God's presence. Pokes us, nudges us, but never gets directly in our face. Because if God did that, then we would not have a free response. Then we would not be voluntarily entering into relationship with God. If you think about the relationships that you've had with friends and spouses, part of the richness of that relationship is the time spent building that relationship. And Hick says, if we were in relationship with God right off the bat, there would be no growth, there would be no development, there would be no history, there would be no building of that relationship. And so if you have a relationship with God, part of what makes that relationship so special is your memories of building that relationship with God over time. And that makes it more special. That makes it a more, take the mic out, of more significance and importance, not only to you and to God. So Hick says, God has created a world in which atheism and doubt is possible. By creating a world in which suffering and evil exist. And atheists interpret this as a sign that God does not exist. And God has created a world in which God is partially hidden from us. And this is the reason, according to Hick, why there are atheists. And this is why people doubt. Because God has built this mode of being into the world so as to elicit a free response from us. And so that's just a thumbnail sketch of this particular philosophy devised by these two philosophers from the UK. I'll stop here, see if you have any questions or reactions or thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so this God's design, the responsibility we actually have for the people we perpetrate is all by design. So like, how much is God responsible for the whole setup, and how much of, God obviously knew we were going to mess up, do these evil things to one another, so that we're not responsible.
God, for speaking as Hick and Swinburne, God is responsible for creating a world in which evil and suffering can happen and are possible. We bear responsibility for the extent to which we're not participating in spiritual and moral development. That development that's going to decrease the amount of moral evil in the world. So in this philosophy, God's not entirely off the hook. There's a shared responsibility. We both bear responsibility, I guess, for people in this philosophy. Excellent question. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, do the philosophers speak at all to the notion, or the Presbyterian notion of predestination?
Yeah, Hick and Swinburne are Anglicans. They're not Presbyterians.
Understood.
Yeah. So a Reformed thinker, a Presbyterian thinker, might go in a different direction than they do. I'd be confident that they would. Yeah, but this comes out of a particular theological tradition, certainly.
The first person that you spoke of this morning, name started with I guess Icarus.
Irenaeus.
Irenaeus. Now you talked about how he
felt that humans, because we were given the freedom, good and evil and such, how did he explain natural disasters and things that would occur as far as God allowing those things to happen?
Yeah. He would say these things are built in as necessary ingredients of the world to foster spiritual and ethical development. I just think, Dr. Bertram and other people in this church who went up to Asheville when the hurricane, did damage there. That presented Dr. Bertram with an opportunity for character development, is what Irenaeus would say. You answered the call. There was a moral call that you felt, responsible for, and you went up there with your goods and supplies and your friends, and you tried to meet a need. He wouldn't have had that experience without that natural disaster. Now, pushback is, isn't there a better way for Dr. Bertram to develop character other than sending a hurricane in the way of Asheville? And that's an understandable objection. But this is a God, the God in this philosophy, this is a tough love God. This is a God who wants to make life difficult for us because this God thinks it's in our own best ultimate interest. And that's a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow.
Just to clarify, I wasn't the leader.
Now I've given you the opportunity to show humility.
So perhaps I agree with elements of both Augustine and Irenaeus. If we have it in our mind that God's creation is perfect by design or the way that he intended it to be, then Irenaeus is right. There are elements that God created in the world to give us challenges. Then perhaps Augustine is correct that we introduce the rest of it. Good people. So God laid a template for the world, and that didn't be altered by us. We didn't create disease. We didn't bring that good and evil into the world. We didn't bring the natural disasters, but we brought the elements that challenge us personally to develop morality, like you say. So I think I would agree with elements of both.
And what's frustrating about this philosophy is you say, well, there's a lot of classmates in this classroom that don't seem to be learning the lesson. And they make life very difficult for us and for everybody else who's trying to do the right thing. Isn't there a way that God could protect us from bad students who aren't growing, who aren't developing? Wouldn't a merciful God, intervene from time to time? And Hicks answers, how much importance, how much value do you place on freedom? And this is the consequence, the price that has to be paid for freedom, for students being challenged to learn. Yes, sir.
So, in that sense, it's like is this God in the scenario allowing for free will, or is it like he's determined, there's a determinism aspect to it?
Yeah, this is getting into some of the more advanced elements of this.
Yeah.
But let's go for it. Hicks says, everyone eventually will enter into a state of moral and spiritual maturity. Some people are going to need time after death to work on this. Not everyone is going to learn the lessons before death. So he says spiritual and moral development in his philosophical theology continues after death. And how hard are the lessons going to be?
How hard are you gonna make it on God to learn you? That's up to you, I guess. You know, some students are stubborn and obstinate. And so, you know, the teacher has to use some stricter measures, I guess. I'll share a Pick's book with you. You can read all this. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. But it's a good question.
Yes, sir.
Always struggle with, what if I were born in India and I was never exposed to, what would these philosophers say about groups of populations that never are exposed to Christ, are never exposed to God, the way we see God, and how do they deal with that when they, as you say, have to meet God and deal with what's their world?
Excellent question. The way they tackle this is they say, Christ has revealed God to be a gracious God, a merciful God, a providential God. And God and God's providence has made sure that God is nowhere in the world without a witness to God. So in a Hindu culture, God is speaking. In a Muslim culture, God is speaking. You know, if God can only move as far as the Christian church moves, well, then God is not God. Christian church is God, is the way that they would put it. So God is active in places that we can't even begin to imagine, in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. So that's how they answer it. Good question. Happy Mother's Day. Thank you for your attention, for being here, for your questions, and I'll be here next week as well. Thank you.